I'm not intimidated by threats from a housewife with no job and no family like you, she sneered. That's right, you're powerless, just like the trash you can't even handle. I get it now, she continued with a smirk. I'm moving out of this house. Good luck, homeless lady, her taunting voice echoed in my ears. I stood there, trying to process her words. This is a great chance for Frank to leave too, she added, turning to him. Come on, let's pack up your stuff and get out. Together, they marched to Frank's room, instructing him to gather his things. Originally, I had only planned to leave, but I never imagined Frank would be thrown out alongside me. My name is Amber, 27 years old, a housewife. I recently married a man named Tom, who is 30, 3 years older than me. At first, I thought he was mature, calm, and had an old soul. He often spoke fondly of his mother, which led me to believe he was a good man who valued his family. But it wasn't until after we were married that I discovered my husband's true nature. On our wedding day, as we exchanged vows, my mother-in-law was all smiles and kind words. I genuinely believed we would have a happy marriage. Shortly after, Tom suggested we move in with his mother, explaining that his father had passed away a few years ago and that he wanted to be close to her. Trusting him and thinking his mother was someone I could rely on, I agreed to the arrangement. But as soon as we were married, everything changed. Both my husband and mother-in-law revealed their true colors. Amber, hurry up and bring me some tea, and clean the bathroom and toilet. Now, my mother-in-law's once gentle voice became sharp and commanding as she barked orders at me. Was she trying to intimidate me, or was this her way of asserting dominance because of her age? She would constantly call out to me, her voice booming through the house, making me do all sorts of chores. But the most shocking revelation was discovering a man I didn't know in the kitchen one morning. I froze, not knowing what to do. Noticing my confusion, he introduced himself. I'm Frank, Tom's younger brother. I had never been told that Tom had a brother, let alone that we would be living with him. It was a startling surprise. Frank was the same age as me minus 27. I approached my mother-in-law, asking her why she hadn't mentioned him before. Oh, you mean Frank? Don't worry about him. He's just a recluse, she responded dismissively. I was stunned. How could she be so indifferent toward her own son? Calling him a ghost, she seemed content with just having Tom around, dismissing Frank as nothing more than a useless hermit who only left the house for grocery shopping. Her words left me disillusioned, shocked at how drastically she had changed since we got married. It was heartbreaking to see a mother discriminate against her own children. As an only child with no siblings to compare myself to, I couldn't fathom being treated this way by my own mother. My parents had already passed away, and I often envied those who still had their families. I longed for parents and children to at least get along. When Tom returned from work, I asked him about Frank, hoping that maybe there was more to their relationship. Just ignore him, Tom replied coldly. Pretend he doesn't exist. He won't bother you. His dismissive tone crushed me. How could he be so heartless, referring to his own brother as if he were nothing? My idealized image of Tom shattered, revealing a man with no real family bonds, a mere mama's boy. After finishing my chores, I went upstairs, regret washing over me. As I turned the corner, I bumped into Frank on his way to the bathroom. You married my brother, didn't you? Frank asked quietly. Yeah, I did, I replied, my voice heavy with uncertainty. I'm sorry, he said, his eyes filled with a sadness I didn't yet understand. It's nothing, but I won't say anything bad. You better get out of here. What? I asked, startled. I'm sorry, but you should consider getting a divorce, Frank continued, his tone serious. His words stung, leaving me confused and a bit offended. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had married my husband because I loved him, and here was his brother, someone I barely knew, suggesting I end our marriage after just one day. It felt surreal. It's none of your business, I retorted. I can handle it. I'm a competitive person. Frank sighed. I'm sorry about that, he said, bowing his head. I'm also sorry for my outburst. I stared at him, taken aback. Just moments ago, I thought he was completely out of line, but now, seeing him apologize so sincerely, I wasn't sure what to think. Maybe he was genuinely trying to warn me, trying to be kind in his own way. As I was processing his words, Frank excused himself and retreated to his room. My husband and mother-in-law had always referred to him as a reclusive oddball, someone they barely acknowledged. But I found myself seeing him differently. He seemed like a decent person, polite even, nothing like the way they described him. The next morning, as I was setting the table for breakfast, Frank came downstairs to grab a drink. "Good morning, Frank," I greeted him with a smile. "Why don't you join us for breakfast?" "Good morning, Amber. Thank you for asking," he replied, but his glance quickly shifted to his mother. "Amber, I'm not eating breakfast with that thing. Just serve the food," my mother-in-law snapped, her tone icy. Frank gave me a brief, apologetic look before quickly retreating to his room. I wanted to apologize for my harsh words the previous day, but the opportunity slipped away. "Hey, just stick to doing the housework, okay? Don't do anything unnecessary," my mother-in-law barked at me, her glare fierce. I was stunned by her hostility. No matter how much she disliked me, I never expected to be treated this way. Even worse was how my husband's attitude had shifted overnight. "What's for lunch today?" he demanded later that day. "Curry," I replied hesitantly. "You should have told me earlier. I had curry for lunch too," he snapped. "How is that my fault?" I thought, but I kept my mouth shut. Why didn't he call me to let me know? It seemed absurd. "Hey, you're not apologizing. Who do you think you are? You're here to do the housework. Understand that," he shouted, his voice harsh and commanding. I stood there in shock, unable to respond. It was becoming painfully clear that Tom didn't love me. He just wanted a housekeeper. It was heartbreaking to realize how calm and indifferent he could be while saying such terrible things. They didn't care about me. They just wanted to make their lives more comfortable, using me as a tool to do so. As I watched them laugh and joke in the living room, I felt a growing sense of isolation, knowing I was merely a convenience to them. I walked upstairs, and as soon as I reached the top, the tears I had been holding back began to flow. I couldn't contain them any longer. Suddenly, a hand gently offered me a handkerchief. "I still think you should leave," said a familiar voice. I looked up and saw Frank standing there. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." I wiped my tears hastily, feeling embarrassed. "I'm sorry I used your handkerchief." "No," Frank replied softly. "I gave it to you because I wanted you to use it." He paused, then added, "I heard what my brother and mother said. They're the worst." His words caught me off guard. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Frank sighed and shared something that made my heart sink. He told me that he had been in a similar situation before. Apparently, my husband had once been engaged to another woman, but she ran away just before the wedding because my mother-in-law and husband had treated her the same way they were treating me now. Hearing this, I felt a wave of relief, mixed with despair. It all made sense now. Their kindness before the marriage was just an act, a facade to keep the bride from fleeing. How could I have been so blind? I had trusted them, and now I felt utterly hopeless. But what could I do? I had nowhere else to go. I was just a housewife with no income and no means to leave. My husband and mother-in-law wouldn't even let me get a part-time job, let alone move out and rent a place of my own. I felt trapped, and all I could do was cry. Then Frank spoke again. "If we keep talking here, it'll look suspicious. Let's meet at a coffee shop next time if you'd like." He handed me a piece of paper with his contact information on it. I nodded, slipping the paper into my pocket as he quietly returned to his room. Determined to regain control of my life, I decided that I had to leave this house. My survival had just begun. "I'm going to the city office to take care of some things, and I'll stop by the supermarket on my way back," I told my mother-in-law as I prepared to leave. "Don't even think about leaving any chores undone," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. But I had made sure everything was in perfect order before I left. As I walked out the door, she mumbled something about not accepting it if I was late for dinner. I pretended to agree and headed straight to the coffee shop where Frank and I had agreed to meet. Over coffee, I confided in Frank. I told him about my parents, how they were gone now, and how I couldn't rely on them anymore. I shared that I had canceled the lease on the house I was renting before the marriage and had quit my job, leaving me with nothing. But deep down, I knew I had to find a way out. This was just the beginning, and I was determined to survive. I told Frank that I would have to start my life over from scratch. It's hard to move out of the house under these circumstances, isn't it? The biggest obstacle is the work. I'm tied up with my mother-in-law and husband from early morning until late at night. Frank seemed deep in thought for a moment before asking, "Amber, can you draw?" I blinked, caught off guard. "Ha! What do you mean?" He smiled. "I mean, can you draw? Like art?" "Well, yes," I replied hesitantly. "I went to art school before." "Really? That's great." Frank's eyes lit up. Just in time. There's a manga artist I know who's looking for an assistant. You can work remotely. But I don't have a computer right now, I said, feeling a bit deflated. No problem, Frank said reassuringly. I'll lend you mine. I have an extra one I'm not using. Really? Thank you so much, I exclaimed, surprised by his generosity. But why do you have an extra computer? What do you do for a living? Frank chuckled softly. It's kind of you to ask. You don't think I'm just a recluse, do you? No, not at all, I said quickly. You're always polite and well-groomed. I never thought that. He nodded. I work from home. I'm actually an engineer. I used to work for a company, but now I run my own business. I was astonished. Really? I had no idea you were a business owner. Yes, Frank continued. It's easier for me to manage things this way since I take on projects independently. We also have a few web designers as employees, but everything is done remotely. So that's why you're home all the time, I mused. But your mother and Tom said you'd just stay home doing nothing. You haven't told them the truth. I don't see any benefit in telling them, he replied calmly. True, I agreed. But if you're such a successful manager, why don't you just leave that house? Frank's expression turned serious. That's a story for another time. Right now, we need to focus on you. Let me introduce you to the manga artist. Without wasting any time, Frank made a phone call, and soon, he had arranged a remote interview for me with the manga artist. The interview was set for Wednesday, a day when my mother-in-law usually had her lessons and would be out with the other participants afterward. I was able to schedule the remote interview during that time, and it seemed to go well. I must have made a good impression because I was hired immediately. Given my situation, they offered to send the necessary documents to Frank's address, ensuring everything remained discreet. With the job secured, the next step was finding a new place to live. I have a friend who works in real estate, Frank said. He can get you a good deal. I couldn't help but wonder who this guy was. He seemed to have endless resources. Thanks to Frank's connections, our search for a new place went smoothly. We quickly signed a lease on a place that fit my needs perfectly. Just when everything seemed to be falling into place, things took a turn. One night, I was awakened by my husband who had just returned home, slightly drunk. Hey, where's dinner? He demanded, shaking me awake. Dinner? It's midnight, I replied groggily. You said you didn't want to eat because you were going out for drinks. Shut up, he snapped. The king comes home, and you won't even get up to greet him. Now you're saying you didn't cook dinner? You're a worthless wife. His words cut deep, igniting a fire in me. Do you have any idea how hard I've been working with your mother for you? I shot back. How dare you act so superior to me? Because you're my wife, he sneered. A wife should support her husband, and your job is to take care of the house. If you can't do that, don't stand against me. A wife who can't do housework is nothing but trash. As he finished speaking, I heard the door creak open. My mother-in-law entered, looking just as displeased. You're nothing but trash, she said coldly. And Frank is trash too. This place is a dump. My husband snickered at her words. Yeah, it's time to take out the oversized trash. What did you just say? I demanded. With a smirk, he opened a drawer and pulled out a document. This is what I mean, he said, holding up divorce papers. You're no good to me anymore. I'm going to find another wife who can actually take care of me. So I'm divorcing you. Get the hell out of my house. You're disgusting. You think of your wife as nothing more than a slave? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Is that what you want in a marriage? Someone who acts like a housekeeper? You think I care about what you say, he scoffed. A jobless, parentless woman like you. What are you going to do? You're just garbage. My mother-in-law chimed in, laughing along with him. That's right, you're nothing but trash, and there's nothing you can do about it. Their words were like knives, but I wasn't going to let them break me. I see how you really feel, I said calmly. I'm moving out of this house. I signed the divorce papers and walked away without looking back. I stuffed the papers into my bag and began packing my belongings, all while my husband and mother-in-law watched with smug grins on their faces. So what now? You're homeless, my husband sneered. Not our problem anymore. Good luck out there, homeless lady. And Frank, my mother-in-law added with a wicked smile. He should be out of here too. Time to take out the trash and clear up some space. They began discussing their plans to remodel the house once we were gone, planning to tear down walls and make the place bigger and more comfortable for themselves. It was clear they were already envisioning their lives without us. They headed to Frank's room and ordered him to pack up and leave as well. I hadn't anticipated that Frank would be forced out with me, and a pang of guilt hit me. Had I dragged him into this mess because I couldn't control my emotions during that fight? "I'm sorry, Frank," I said, feeling a weight of responsibility. "This is my fault." But Frank just smiled and shrugged. "Don't worry about it. I realized a while ago that I can't keep living with these people. Besides, I've got other plans now. Maybe it was a good thing we had that fight." His calm demeanor eased my mind slightly. At least he didn't seem too upset about leaving. 2 days later, on Wednesday, when my mother-in-law was out of town, Frank and I called a moving company and left for good. As we finished moving, my mother-in-law called my new place. "Don't worry, we're all gone," I said into the phone. "Frank and I moved out together." "Good," she replied, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "I'm glad I don't have to see you two anymore." She hung up, clearly pleased with herself, but she had no idea what was coming next. Frank and I were planning our revenge, though we kept it to ourselves for now. Moving into a rented house, I managed to settle in and start fresh. Thanks to Frank, I received a substantial settlement from my husband in the divorce. Frank had overheard my husband and mother-in-law's vile comments during our fight and secretly recorded them. Their statements were so damning that they fell under marital and family status harassment. This evidence was crucial in proving that the divorce was entirely due to my husband and mother-in-law's behavior. With that chapter closed, I could finally begin my new life. I managed to secure a substantial alimony settlement, a small victory in my revenge against my ex-husband. Frank's friend, a lawyer, handled the legal side for me. My ex-husband was completely blindsided by the court's decision and accepted the payment without question. Frank's connections were invaluable, and I was incredibly grateful for his help. I decided not to delve into the details any further. A few days later, my ex-mother-in-law began bombarding me with phone calls. It felt like a relentless barrage, as if a demon were knocking at my door. I had intended to block the calls, but in the end, I had no choice but to answer. "Amber, where are you?" she demanded. "I'm not obliged to tell you anything. I'm a complete stranger now," I replied coolly. "Please, don't be like that. I'm calling because, where's Frank?" she asked, sounding desperate. "Why do you want to know where Frank is?" I inquired. "I'm trying to find him, but he's vanished," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "That's too bad. Maybe he doesn't want anything to do with you anymore," I taunted. The speaker crackled with irritation. "Stop being ridiculous. You two moved out together. You must know where he is." "I do know where he is, but I'm not telling you," I said defiantly. "Search for him yourself." "Where are you anyway?" she continued. "You have no home, no job, no place to stay. If you beg, I might let you back, but you'd only be a housekeeper." "Why would I come back to you?" I retorted. "I have a job and a place to live now. There's no reason for me to return." "That's a lie." My ex-husband's voice broke through. He seemed astonished that I had managed to turn my life around so quickly. "I won't correct you," I said. "But if you call me again or show up, I'll call the police." "Wait a minute," he shouted as I hung up the phone. I promptly blocked both his and my mother-in-law's numbers. They were frantic because they had just realized the truth. They had mistakenly believed that my father-in-law had left them a fortune, but it was actually Frank who had been transferring money to his mother's account each month. When Frank was forced out of the house, he stopped the transfers. My mother-in-law thought Frank was just a recluse, not realizing that the money she relied on was gone. Frank had cut ties with his family after being ousted, leaving them in financial ruin. My ex-husband, unable to pay the alimony, was left struggling, and my mother-in-law was now facing financial hardship without the regular transfers. Neither of them deserved my sympathy. They had treated Frank terribly, and now they were facing the consequences. Meanwhile, Frank had purchased a luxury flat in Tokyo and was living comfortably. The truth was, he had been providing for his family all these years to honor a promise to his father. His father, who had passed away, had asked Frank to take care of his mother and brother despite their unkindness. Frank's dedication to his father's wish was both admirable and heartbreaking. He had endured so much to fulfill that promise, only to be mistreated by those he helped. When I met with Frank after moving out, he shared the story of his promise to his father. I agreed with his decision and hoped for his happiness. Despite the painful deception I had faced, Frank's support had been a beacon of hope. A year later, Frank proposed to me, and that's a story for another time. The drastic change in my life after my marriage ended was painful, But I was glad to have found happiness with someone as reliable as Frank. Life had presented its obstacles, but now happiness seemed within reach. Thank you for following my journey until the end. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video.